teach a lesson about other lessons and a context to enhance. But what do you suppose our teacher has us do? He skips the lesson and makes us present a digital LEQ. Elocution needs historical evidence, reason that can corroborate and advance a complex pieces that John P. Irish would admire. Then we drop the screencast like a single that inspired. Student created screencasts for you to like, subscribe, and share. We know you've had all the John and Steve that you can bear. If we get the most views by 10 p.m. Eastern on the 5th day, we earn 500 bonus points, which virtually guarantees an A. Without much more fanfare or ado, we present our digital LEQ.
Okay, so today we will be discussing the gender roles and family relations in East Asia and Western Europe. At the start of period circa 1850 to 2000, women and families were more stable and valued in Western Europe than in Eastern Asia. However, post-World War reconstruction led to improved East Asian marriage policies, while war efforts in Western Europe offered more work opportunities for women to provide for their families. Therefore, after political intervention and avid protesting from women themselves, by the end of the 19th century, both regions made progress towards more equal status for women and more solid family structures. So here are a few questions that you guys should kind of just take into consideration and be prepared to answer them at the end. So first we have, what were the common roles of women in East Asia and Western Europe during 1850 to 2000? What were the opposing ideas amongst women and men in terms of women gaining independence and why? Also, how can belief systems explain the difference in how women were treated in the two regions, my apologies. So as far as contextualization, we see in East Asia, 1700s to 1914, women had little freedom and society was corrupted because of opium trade. In East Asia, 1914 to present, women were able to gain prestigious jobs although they remained inferior to men. Women can also divorce and marry again. However, they are expected to provide sons. In Western Europe, 1700s to 1914, we see that within the Industrial Revolution, poor women who had taken care of home or worked in fields have now shifted to factories. We see that feminism has begun, and we see full property rights are now being developed by the end of the 19th century. That includes divorce laws, higher education, and generally being active in politics. Lastly, we have Western Europe from 1914 to present. Women and men are almost equal. There is a greater economic role in World War I and World War II. And now women can choose to get married and they're not so much dependent on their family in that aspect to make those type of choices. And they're also well educated, and we see that this is one of the most prominent regions for women. So the major similarities between the two regions were that men were considered to be the head of the household in both regions, so that applies to the family relation and gender roles, while women also protested for equality in both regions, so they're fighting for more gender roles in both their societies. Now, the differences between the regions would be Europe encouraging women to join the industrial workforce during wartime efforts, while Asian society more so encouraged agricultural and domestic support from women. So they're giving them different gender roles and honing in on those different areas. Also, European Christians encourage monogamy in their marriages and families, while Asian Confucians condone polygamy, which is more than one person in a relationship. So this is all about family relationship and how they approach it differently.
So now we will discuss Western Europe specifically in terms of gender roles and family relations. So first we have this source, and this is one of the many appearances of the women's liberation movement, um, also known as the WLM, which lasted from the 1960s to the 1980s. In this particular image, women are demonstrated in front of the Hague for equal pay on May 29th, 1975. So the WLM took momentum in so many countries, but of course, we are mainly focused on Europe. So the motive was to sought freedom to free women from oppression and male supremacy. Additionally, they fought for better working conditions, equal pay, and free anatomy for women's bodies. This proves our thesis because ultimately women were tired of the treatment and oppression that they were receiving, so they did something about it. In this case, it includes protesting for equality in all aspects: political, social, cultural, economic, and religious. Um, yeah. So next we have this quote from Mary Wollstonecraft, which reads, "Women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrary, governed without any direct share allowed them in the deliberations of government." So Mary Wollstonecraft, is an inspiring figure to the WLM. Though she passed before the time of this particular movement, many women used her words as inspiration and building blocks for the WLM. In this particular quote, she's saying that women deserve basic human rights. The goal of the movement is fighting for the rights of women, which never had any ill intent towards men or to take anything away from them, but rather to gain mutual benefits for both genders. That includes voting, working, education, etc. To women, it just wasn't right how they had so many restrictions limiting what they could and could not do. Furthermore, the little expectations of them and what they had the ability to do was absurd. Therefore, elaborating on our thesis in terms of the treatment of women prior and during this time period in Europe. So now we have the situation and point of view of that particular source, which is Mary Wollstonecraft stated her stand, which was very much transparent after her time and during the women's liberation movement time period in regards to the rights of women, which relates back to the general point of our thesis. As for a point of view, this source is significant because it emphasizes one of two sides of the matter at hand. In this case, Mary Wollstonecraft is for women's rights. Additionally, her statement allowed us to see truly how restricted women were prior and during that time. So now we have the other side to women gaining equal rights to men. So this image is from the Stop ERA movement, which had the motive to campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment. The lady in the trench coat holding the sign was the chairwoman of the Stop ERA, Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly believed that Equal Rights Amendment would force women into the military, jeopardize benefits under Social Security, and weaken existing legal protections under divorce and marriage laws. She once said that women enjoyed the most rights and rewards and the fewest duties. In order to weaken the strength of movements of opposing ideas, she would persuade the other woman, with her thoughts that the ERA was a more radical assault on marriage and family, in which she succeeded. And all this counter argues our thesis and shows that not all women wanted equal rights between men and women.
This is a secondary source. It is a cartoon from The Vote, a newspaper published by the Women's Freedom League. And in the cartoon, you can see a wife asking her husband for the rest of his wages so that she can pay the landlord and pay for food for their children. And the husband is telling her to shut up and that what he does with his money is none of her business. And basically, this cartoon shows that within families during the 19th century, men were considered the providers and the head of the household because they worked and brought home money, while the women would stay home and take care of the children and household chores. The male also made all economic and political decisions, and it was because of this families were solely dependent on the man. And so, situation, the cartoon depicts how women were seen as inferior to men during the 19th century. And this relates back to our thesis because it shows the duties of both the male and females within families. And point of view, this source was created by an editor for The Vote and was published by the Women's Freedoms League. Um, it is significant because it shows both the roles women and men played in society and within their families. Um, this picture is a primary source and it shows chippers or women working in working industrial jobs. And during World War II, there was a huge increase in demand for female and male laborers. Many women that were wives and mothers had took up industrial and factory jobs, and it was because of this the females um, and many because many females' husbands were off at war, they had became the sole provider for their households. And once the war was over, most of the females returned back to their normal duties pre-war, but some had fought to keep the same positions, and this had caused many to rethink the female's role in society. So, this quote is from a 19th century journal entry written and published by a European missionary stationed in China pre World War I. The missionary highlights the main differences between how women in Europe were treated under Christianity versus how women in East Asia were treated under Confucianism. The writer states that women of Western Europe were enriched and uplifted, while East Asian women were neglected and degraded. The entry serves to support a point in our thesis about the difference in the roles of women in the two regions. Asian women were given insignificant societal duties and were treated as such. However, women were given meaningful work in Europe and were treated more valuable as well. So, for the situation of the source, a missionary is reporting on his observation of Chinese Confucian society in the Chinese Recorder and Missionary Journal for his English speaking audience. The point of view, the significance of the source's point of view comes from the fact that it's written by a European missionary. That means that the missionary holds Christian ideals when entering and observing Confucian society. When they report in the article, they find and note the differences that separate the two regions. Um, this source is a secondary source, and it is from the book Women Work in Household and Industrializing Asia, and is by Samita Sen. And the quote reads: "The journey from the field to the factory has always been seen as more arduous and more transformative for women. Industrialization, it is believed, causes a sharp, sudden disjuncture in the pattern of women's work. In the old family household system, women were part of family labor, included in household economic activity. And so in Asia before industrialization, women would mainly do household and agricultural chores, but these roles had changed when Asia started to industrialize in the 19th century. Um, and during Asia industrializing, women had started to enter the workforce and were getting jobs in things such as factories. And due to women starting to enter into the workforce, their previous duties, such as raising the children and working on family farms, were often neglected.
So, this next source is a 1953 propaganda poster that was published at a time where Chinese rulers were attempting to restructure marriage policies. Under the new 1950 marriage law, China hoped to recenter the meaning of matrimony and refocus the union on creating stable families and more equal partners after the revolution.
In the poster, we see young girls impressed by young hunting men while the wives and children await the arrival of the husbands and fathers. This is how Chinese government wanted to portray the blossoming family systems. So the situation of the source, the post-World War II revolution led to many women activists who protested for gender equality. So before the war, men were known to belittle and beat and abuse their wives, but the new marriage law became a step towards equality starting in the home. The significance of the point of view comes from the fact that it's created by the government rather than its citizens. So this is an image of what the Chinese rulers wanted the new marriage laws to provide. They showed what they wanted citizens to believe in so they can gain support for their new policies.
So, as far as theme analysis, we see theme 2 and theme 5. Theme 2 being cultural developments and interactions is apparent because of the mindsets within society that men were superior to women in the movement that were formed. So we see theme 5 being the social interactions and organization because of the movements and protests that took place to emphasize the need for change and equality amongst men and women. Additionally, you have those who were for and against equality, and both sides fought for their belief. So now, this is our conclusion, which goes back to those big idea questions that I told you guys to sit on and just take into consideration. This will be a good time for you all to pause and develop your responses to these questions, and then you can play it once you have your responses. So first we have, what were the common roles of women in East Asia and Western Europe during 1850 to 2000? So we see that women were tasked with being caregivers. They would care for children, clean the house, cook, etc. Additionally, women were expected to birth children and offer up their bodies for that particular service. Men were expected to be the providers. They would work and pay bills. Next, we have, what were the opposing ideas amongst women and men in terms of women gaining independence and why? Most women thought that they were owed the same rights as men. They wanted to work, vote, gain education, etc. Most men thought the complete opposite. They enjoyed being women superiors and holding that sense of entitlement, hence the reason for the protests and general political uprising. Lastly, we have, how can belief systems explain the difference in how women were treated in the two religions? So, those who chose to follow Christianity, mainly in the European society, would value the respect, will value and respect women more than those who followed the Confucian belief system, which was mainly in Asia. So I do want to say that these are just possible responses to these questions. There's so many more. So if you feel as though that you have a response that is so, then yeah. Lastly, this is just a few sources that we used, and thank you.